Hey everybody, I'm Costas.
I'm Lester. Welcome to another episode of What's with RWE, and we have again another special guest with us today. Actually, based out of Toronto, a lovely east coast of Canada. We have Aaron Leibtag on, and he is actually part of our board. He's actually a member on our board of directors. Aaron is also, of course, the CEO of Pentavere. So Pentavere, for those of you who are really deep into the Canadian AI space, well-known pioneer in this industry, and of course, they recently were acquired by Healwell AI. Hey, Aaron, how's it going?
Great, Lester. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Excellent, excellent. So I heard that there's a little bit of a heat wave out in Toronto, right? So how do you survive that?
Stay inside, air conditioned. It's a good thing. Lots of work to do, so you know, seems to be the best way.
Perfect, perfect. So now that we're shifting away from the heat wave, maybe you can let the audience know a little bit about what you do at what is Pentavere's? Why should people care about Pentavere? I know a lot of people already know your organization, but for those of the audience that aren't familiar with Pentavere, maybe you can expand on that.
No, absolutely. So myself and Stephen Aviv, my fellow co-founder, started Pentavere to solve the problem that the majority of the health information that we create. So, if we think about our own electronic health record and all of the data that is in there, is actually not used at scale, at speed, efficiently to improve outcomes. And we started Pentavere in response to a tragedy as a result of that reality. Stephen's mother went into a hospital for an operation. It should have been routine. She has, comorbidities like so many people do. That was captured by her care team in the electronic health record, but missed by another care team because it was buried in a clinical note and she passed away as a result. So here you have one individual in particular who spent 25 years in financial services building systems where data helps companies make money, and such a catastrophic gap in data occurred. And we started to unpack this particular problem and we're shocked that this happens every day. So the majority of patients in healthcare systems here in Canada and the US, throughout the world, fall through the cracks. And what we mean specifically about that is they don't receive treatments, medication, interventions that could be standard of care, that can be best practices. And health is impacted as a result. And where we thought we could have impact is if we can create technology that can accelerate the speed of discovery of knowledge that's in the electronic health record.
That's interesting. So that is a very big undertaking, and I know it's taking you a number of years to bring some of those tools to the market. If I'm thinking of this, there's obviously been obstacles along the way in creating it. Technology, I think, is probably the easiest part of that equation. What were the obstacles as you started to try to develop the tools and the solutions to address this issue?
Yeah. So I think for the entrepreneurs who are listening, starting a business, going from zero to one, is a road of obstacles. It's a road where, unfortunately, the likely outcome is failure. One of the things that we did differently right from the beginning, which made us sober to the specific obstacles, Costas, that I think you're asking about, is at our expense, we embedded ourselves in one of Canada's leading hospitals, St. Michael's Unity Health, for 2 years to really understand the problem. We incubated ourselves in an incubator that wasn't set up for technology, but was set up to validate medical devices through, traditional clinical trial pathways. And that was probably the best thing we could have done because it opened our eyes to the realities that we needed to be acutely aware of if we actually wanted to be successful to deliver upon, the vision of actually unlocking data from the electronic health record in an ethical way, in a compliant way, to be able to have impact. So, to speak specifically about some of the obstacles, number one, we realize that clinicians are incredibly busy. There's a lot of technologies they deal with. There's a lot of promises made, and their primary job is helping patients. So really understanding that how busy they are, how much time they spend interacting with the electronic health record and what's missed, and really empathizing with their time, their priorities, which is about the patient. The second thing we sort of repeatedly is privacy matters. It's not an afterthought. You can complain around, whether it's impeding patient care or not impeding patient care. We think it's the right thing to do, but having a clear understanding around privacy, around ethics, not just from a privacy standpoint, but what does that mean from a data security standpoint? What does that mean in terms of using data? What does that mean in terms of rights? And we architected our solution from the very beginning with those very real rate limiting factors in mind. The other thing, just to round it off, is there's a lot of talk today. We're all seeing the incredible performance of NVIDIA and GPUs, but in a Canadian hospital in particular, they're not operating on GPUs. They could be operating on an old AS400 server. So if you're serious about using technology to accelerate discovery from electronic health records, how are you even taking into account those low compute environments? And we built and thought through the problem with those scarcities, those constraints in mind. Probably something that every VC would tell you not to pay attention to because it may slow down recurring revenue. But those foundational elements, I would say, were the key to our success.
Great. Actually, going back a bit, Aaron, to help the audience understand this, because I'm sure, because it's a really critical piece that you mentioned that, it's very unfortunate what happened to Stephen's mother, and that's just really, really sad story. So a lot of the audience, say the billions of people that are watching that are not familiar with the Canadian health system, you just assume, okay, I told this doctor the set of facts about myself or the nurse, how come it doesn't go to the next care team? Like, that just seems ridiculous. Like, why is that the case? Maybe you can expand upon what's causing some of those critical not miscommunication, but these gaps.
Absolutely. It's really a function of how health information exists. So we all understand an Excel spreadsheet, data in very clean rows and columns. Anybody who interfaces with any type of system understands the idea of drop down boxes. Now, the reality is our electronic health record, the majority of the information, over 80% of that, is in unstructured clinical text. It's the clinician notes that they document or their transcriptions. When you're sharing with them those critical, important pieces of information that they use one-on-one to determine how do they provide care, how you're feeling, your patient, your family history, past procedures that you've done. On top of that, you have all of the correspondence between the various people on your care team. And that can include everything from a letter from a primary care physician to a specialist to different service units in the hospital sharing their transcription, their diagnostic reports about a particular patient. So what you end up having is, for a single patient record, you could have hundreds and hundreds of pages of material that we expect our clinicians to read through to get up to speed, or as up to speed as they possibly can, around a particular care pathway, or if you say, okay, is this patient a candidate for clinical trials? What is inclusion exclusion criteria in terms of we want to generate real world evidence? I want to know patients with this demographics, these comorbidities, who took medications at this line of therapy. That does not exist in the drop down boxes of any electronic health record, including Cerner, including Epic, anywhere in the world. So think of a skyscraper's worth of data that somebody has to go through in order to generate these data sets, understand best practices, make evidence-based decisions. And again, going back, clinicians don't have the time. And that's where, applications of AI can have huge, huge impact.
Great. And just to pull on one thread so that you can explain it, because you're going to do a way better job than I'm going to do, is the concept between unstructured and structured. Why is that so important? Just so the audience can understand, oh, like they capture the notes. Like, why is there unstructured? So what? Why is that a problem? What is the importance of the difference between structured and unstructured, and what is the power between, say, a structured data set as opposed to unstructured?
Thank you for asking the question to clarify for the audience. And I apologize if wasn't. A structured data set is rows and columns. An unstructured data set is narrative. It's paragraphs of our voice or our typing. It's essays. It's, I met Lester the other day and he's a fine gentleman and he came in exhibiting A, B, and C. And I'm going to send him for this particular test. And it's reams and reams of text that up until recently, and this is where we're seeing the power of large language models. We're seeing the power of natural language processing, which we were at the forefront. So coming out of St. Michael's Hospital, we published with them one of the first natural language processing papers using in production electronic health records, comparing the output of an algorithm or technology's ability to read what you're asking about unstructured clinical text, to assign meaning to it based on the messiness of how we document spelling mistakes, correct information, incorrect information, conflicting information, but compared against people manually going through those charts to understand what's happening and build those data sets. And that's a really important point, Lester, is the current state of generating data sets for registries, for real world evidence studies, is people manually going through this unstructured clinical text, which is reams and reams and reams, often 5 different screens within a hospital, of paragraph narrative dictation or PDF diagnostic reports, to pull that information out, to put it into essentially a structured format, which is rows and columns. It's incredibly time consuming. It's incredibly expensive. It's, hit or miss from an accuracy perspective. And surely it's not scalable and reproducible, which is why the majority of the health information we create is not used to improve healthcare decisions. And we saw that, just to finish off, as we all went through COVID-19 and the pandemic. We saw a tale of two stories around the power of AI and the promise in technology. On one hand, data science and advanced analytics enabled the incredible acceleration of us to be able to understand our genomics and come up with new vaccines. On the other hand, we couldn't give evidence-based direction to our citizens saying, if you're a woman between the ages of 40 to 45 with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, based on actual data, stay home. But if you're a 20-year-old with rheumatoid arthritis, yes, you're auto compromised, but based on data, your risk is really low. Go out into the world. We couldn't give that type of data because so much of our information is in unstructured data. And that's exactly, what we solved for at Pentavere.
Thanks a lot. That helps a lot, especially when you frame it that way.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Aaron, you guys have now worked not just in Canada, you've worked across the border in the US. is anyone, doing it in a way that I think can be reproducible, that, or is they're using it consistently? It's not a one-off for a study here or there. Has it, or is there anything we can learn from others to deploy here in Canada?
So there's always things we can learn. The challenge when you talk about deployment is the incentives are so much different in the US versus Canada. But that's, there's good and bad associated with it. So I would argue in Canada, we are developing best in class AI. And Pentavere, amongst others, is an example of that. And some of the tensions or the constraints um, is enable that, right? That, one of the points of differentiation for Pentavere is we actually went through to validate scientific method, quite frankly, because there was no economic deployment model within Canadian hospitals to scale that type of technology. Whereby in the US, you're seeing many, many applications to identify patients to lower readmission risks or care orchestration because there's clear incentives and economics associated with that healthcare system that's completely different within our healthcare system. So it's not a technical question around learnings, right? Did this large language model or did this algorithm work really well in Nebraska or in Stanford, but it wouldn't work well here? I think we're leading and demonstrating that, and our work with Hamilton Health Sciences in terms of the learning health system is an example of that. But can we take the incentive model on why so many companies are able to scale commercially and have that impact for patients at scale in terms of capturing them and bring that to Canada? It's challenging because of our incentive model and because of how we're set up as a healthcare system in Canada. And these are challenges, a lot of folks are working on.
Yeah. I, have you had these discussions with, hospital administrators, for example? Is there an incentive model that would move them, or is that the wrong level to even be starting to think about incentives? Does it have to be higher up? Where does the conversation need to start?
Yeah. So number one, good conversations with all people across the spectrum who operate in good faith to help patients are worthwhile and productive conversations. From a decision right impact perspective, these are conversations that A, need to happen at the provincial ministry level, and really, thoughtfully, likely should be a discussion at the federal provincial level. We have healthcare administered by every province, but funded federally. So that creates a whole slew of complexity. I can share, I was just in, a province talking to at the ministry level, at the health authority level, as well as at the medical association level. Those three organizations just within a single province, according to law and the act, all have different decision rights and incentives that increase complexity as well. So, these are the types of conversations that, we need to be sober about. That being said, when you're able to get alignment, you know, we can have impact, but it's challenging. And I think that, the thing that I'm hearing constantly from policymakers, from, folks, in the ministry and government at the C-suite of hospitals, is we all recognize that the status quo is unsustainable. We all recognize and, want to protect the values, the access, the equity of our, Canadian healthcare system. And things are going to need to change. And, change occurs, number one, from patients saying, we need better. And then number two, great policymakers saying, okay, how are we going to rethink incentives, with the introduction of AI to deliver healthcare in the 21st century and beyond
Yeah.
in Canada.
Yeah, because I mean, if we look at the U.S. model, yeah, sorry, Lester, but if we look at the U.S. model, it was all about financial incentives. That really was the biggest mover, I think, in terms of addressing some of those gaps, or patients falling through the gaps. All those examples that you referred to earlier, it was basically you need to ensure that patients are effectively managed, not just in your institution, but in the long run. And if you can't do that, you suffer financial penalties when that happens. I mean, nothing better than a negative financial consequence to get people really engaged in the process, and in having better tools and using the data at hand.
Yeah, I can give a really specific example around work that we're doing that, brings that to life. So, valvular heart disease in the United States of America, and here, 2.5% of the population is impacted. 40% of these patients fall through the cracks. So, even in the US system, where there is a clear margin accretive financial incentive to identify these patients and bring them in for a valve replacement, because if you've got coverage that's $77,000 DRG with about a $30,000 contribution, even if Medicare, it's still break even. So revenue accretive for an institution. These patients still fall through the cracks because of the unstructured data, but there it's a really, really simple ROI, right? You bring these patients in, the improved outcomes is clear. Them falling through the cracks is actually a 40% increase in morbidity. And the hospital creates sustainability for the hospital and reduces the readmission risks. In Canada, that set of incentives don't exist. So let me be really clear. So no, that doesn't mean that a clinician who sees a patient for a valve replacement isn't going to do everything possible to treat that patient as quickly and efficiently as possible, but it's still more volume in a system that is under duress. And one senior Canadian healthcare policymaker shared the following point to me. And again, it's not my point, but it really hit home, and I think speaks to what you say. He says, in the U.S., the CEO of a hospital manages their P&L. In Canada, the CEO of a hospital manages the politics of their P&L. Now, both CEOs are passionate about improving patient care. Let me make that 100% clear. But that point speaks to the difference of incentives between both systems that have both pluses and minuses.
I do want to keep on, expand that conversation around incentives, but I'm going to take the conversation slightly for a tangent right now. It's just a small tangent, just because I think quite a few of the audience who are looking to start up their own company could learn a lot from your experience. So somebody had articulated, I think it may have been Elon Musk. I'm obsessed with him right now, and been reading his biography, right? But that, starting your own company is like staring into the abyss and chewing glass at the same time. So you have gone the unfortunate route of doing it in healthcare in Canada, which is even probably worse. It's probably like standing in like a pit of fire at the same time, right? So maybe just let the audience know, like, how did you, what is your story, Aaron? How did you get to the point of where you're at right now? What motivated you to kind of go down this route, knowing that this was probably going to be incredibly challenging?
Yes. So I'll echo that quote from Elon Musk. There's nothing romantic, there's nothing easy about a startup and going, as Peter Thiel says, from that 0 to 1. A lot of programs and accelerators try to gamify it, try to say, here's, the formula to success. What we always sort of question was, well, how can you have a formula of success if 99.5% of these ventures fail? So the acknowledgement of this is really, really hard. There are no shortcuts. It will likely be the most taxing, brutal, bare knuckle fight that you will ever take on. And to answer your question, and this is my advice to entrepreneurs, is there is truth in that statement that the power of a why can trump and overcome the how. And if you truly believe in why you took the incredible risk to start a company, likely at the financial peril of you and your family, that why has to be true to you, and it cannot be about making money. It cannot be about being on the cover of a magazine. It has to be that you are so passionate and believe so much in the impact of the problem that you are solving that you are able to wake up every day with both a skip in your step, knowing that your day is most likely going to be filled with solving and dealing with very difficult problems across the spectrum. And you got to go to bed at night and sleep because you need your energy and wake up again the next day. And if you can do that without end, right, which is a mindset, and the entrepreneurs that I've spoken to that I look up to, and now being on the other side of that crucible, if you can do that again without end, you will be successful. But most people, from a grit and a tenacity perspective, just aren't prepared or willing to do that, which speaks to the why. And that's sort of the true advice that I would give any entrepreneur, going and starting any type of company. And yes, in healthcare, it's that much more difficult. And in Canada, it was even that much more difficult. But really gracious that when we think about our exit and the group of entrepreneurs that aligned to our story, first Hamid Shabazi, who's the chairman of Well, was just the number one healthcare leader, in Canada by Maclean's magazine. And then, Alex are both entrepreneurs who went through their own crucibles. So they understand that. And that was a big part of sort of, the success of now Heal Well AI.
Great, great, great. Yeah, I could imagine. That's a definitely something food for thought there. But good on you guys for going down that route and tackling a very, very incredibly challenging problem. So in terms of like going back to incentives, recently I think the Canadian government, at least the federal government, has tried to say, hey, you know what? Provinces will give you a little bit more money for healthcare, or not little, a lot more money for healthcare, if you can provide back metrics that demonstrate that there is an improvement in care, right? So, do you think things like this, where of course having real time data probably would be quite beneficial, and be able to take unstructured data and then structuring it so you can do these measurements would be, it seems like it would be a huge need for that. Do you think this new dynamic would be helpful, or are there other dynamics that would be helpful, you believe, to spur innovation in Canada, especially in the healthcare space? Because of course you've gone through the ringer already, so we don't want others to have to go through the exact same ringer. Is there ways to make it easier for our organizations to still provide obviously a great product, but like it's not like making them jump through all these hoops that aren't somewhat unnecessary and do not really benefit the patient?
Yeah. So there's always going to be hoops. But to answer the first part of your question around outcomes based metrics and that type of alignment and the idea of value based care, the short answer is yes, absolutely. Right. I know, we've seen the benefits when executed correctly and, quality based measures. Um, so, that is a relatively easy answer around yes. Now, going back to some of the structural change management complexity, you're moving a large oil tanker to be able to get there. but it's the right point, the right turn will create the right behaviors. And quite frankly, clinicians I speak to, policymakers I speak to, hospital administrators I speak to, all believe in that outcomes based measurement. Again, they'll question how and what is the integrity of the scorecard. But from a principal perspective, the answer is yes. Now, to answer your second question, I'm going to unpack that word innovation, because I would argue that Canada has actually led an innovation, but unfortunately hasn't been able to, be the recipients of the treasure of those innovations. And that point hit home for me really clearly when, so Pentavere was nominated in 2023 for the Pre-Gallian Best Digital Health Startup Award, which for those who don't know Pre-Gallian, it's the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in life science. And I can talk about how on earth did a Canadian company even get on the radar as a function of our peer-reviewed publications. But we found ourselves in the gala dinner in New York City, as they were presenting the top awards. And of course, Ozempic and Novo Nordisk won Best Pharmaceutical Innovation in 2023. But what was startling is the president of Novo Nordisk got up and told their founding story. Their founding story is a husband and wife who were on vacation, who took a sidetrack to Toronto just to see it, bumped into a bunch of folks who came up with how to manufacture insulin, somehow got for 10 cents on the dollar the rights to that outside of Canada, and were able to commercialize that and create a tremendous amount of prosperity for that entire region. Number two, Ozempic. I don't know how many people in this audience knows, but I started doing GLP-1s was invented by a Toronto doctor, discovered by a Toronto doctor at Sinai, amongst others. Yet how much of that massive invention is going back to fund our healthcare system and create that prosperity? So innovation, we're incredible at, and we should be proud of, and are world leaders at. What we think about at Pentavere and then at HealWell, going back, is okay, how can we better commercialize? Not so the IP goes outside of Canada, but commercialization creates jobs, it creates sustainability, it reduces costs to benefit all of us as Canadians. And there is, a huge opportunity that we can get better at, but unfortunately doesn't have to do about innovation. All has to do with the first part of your question. Okay, if we pick something like quality-based measures, thinking through incentives in a small area, how can we get really good at executing that? And those are some of the conversations I know we're starting to have as HealWell AI and Well Health Technologies, given the footprint we now have, to see if we can contribute to those types of discussions. But it's again, it's not going to be easy, and it is a shift, and we should be sober at our track record in doing these things.
That's really interesting. It makes me ask the question of, what is what is the market that we are trying to serve? Because you can't create a product and fit it to that market if you don't really know what that is to begin with, right? So, for us day to day, we are neck deep in data, both of us, and for us, typically, we're addressing the needs of, uh, you know, government payers or biopharmaceutical companies that are data hungry to make decisions to try to determine what's their next step. Who is really the market that you're trying to serve? Or are there just different markets that need that same product? It's just a matter of how they operationalize it.
Yeah. So we're in the same business, right, around RWE. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about real world evidence from a life science perspective, but if you go back to, if 90% of the health information we create isn't used to improve health outcomes at scale and speed, if over 80% of patients fall through the cracks in some way, shape, or form, which means they're not getting the treatments, interventions, procedures that science says will improve their outcomes, right? Um, if we can enrich data and get the right data to the right person to create the right action, then we should be able to close those care gap loops. So better data, better insights is the product. Now the question comes down to what is that particular insight and how can that be actioned and productized? So we're thinking a lot around clinical decision support co-pilots. You saw we just published actually yesterday and then a few weeks ago in JAMA, both with Sunnybrook Hospital and then yesterday with Princess Margaret Cancer, the idea of what was in JAMA was the idea of can we accelerate and automate cancer staging? We all know what happens and how important the right staging is to the trajectory of care and outcome. And it takes an incredible amount of time. And if we can automate and accelerate that to help clinicians, big outcome. Yesterday with Princess Margaret, can that same thing be able to identify patients with various radiation toxicities? Check. It's being presented at the American Society of Radiation Technology. Now, if you were to say, how quickly will those models be deployed and scaled within Canadian hospitals? That's where it falls down and we don't have an answer for, right? So you can have the product, but how do you get that product and the business model with the incentives you've talked about into the various users? And unfortunately this is the grind. Like one of the things, if we were to create a headline around population health, I think the stat is in our emergency departments across Canada, and we've all waited in line. We all know what's happening, despite the incredible hard work of clinicians, the heroic effort of nurses, and putting a lot of money into it. I think the stat is 30% of all emergency visit strokes, 40% of cardiovascular events, and 70% of non-traumatic amputations are a result of people just not managing their diabetes well, just not managing their A1C scores, right? Which is available and it's not in access. If we were to just pull on that thread and reduce what I just described, it would unlock a huge amount of healthcare capacity. So the question for the audience is like, why can't we do that? What's getting in the way of us scaling that? And there's a lot of great stakeholders working on it, and I'm optimistic that that particular problem will be solved, but it's not going to be solved next month, right? And it hasn't been solved yet, and we're in 2024.
Yeah, because otherwise it feels very much like the rest of the Canadian economy, very much sort of the raw product, the sort of the whether it's minerals or metals or whatever, shipped off somewhere else, repackaged and sold back to us, right? I mean, we have the lab, we have the capabilities here, we have the know-how, centers like the Vector Institute, Mila in Montreal. The talent is there, and we're continuing to train them. It just doesn't seem like we're able to then turn that back and actually capitalize it in our own market.
Yeah, listen, that's a question way above my ability to think through, way above my pay grade. But what we can say is, as a Canadian entrepreneur who developed world class Canadian IP and exited to a Canadian company working on these problems, right? Like these are things that, folks who are at that altitude in government, in policy, should take note of and say, how can we replicate and scale these types of successes? Because, as Canadians, we need it and we deserve it, right? Canadians are a great people. We're a great country. We're a model in terms of the diversity of our society, in terms of our tolerance. we deserve these things. We shouldn't have to wait 8 hours in an emergency room, to get care.
That's our cold open. It's like you deserve it. It's like
We do.
mil-
We do.
I, I obviously love that. I do have one a question around two questions. One around what you talked about around AI, and another one around privacy. That you talked about that it's super important. So I do want to get back to that from the AI component. And great that you corrected me in that it's not the innovation piece, it's the commercialization piece, which I wholeheartedly agree. And a shout out to the guys over at Acquire that did an episode about Novo Nordisk and went through the whole Canadian story and how we basically really dropped the ball on that one. That was a layup, and we really messed up that layup, right? Or it was empty net, and we like shot the puck and didn't like that wasn't even close, right? So how do we not miss that again for AI? It seems like this is Nick's wave, Nick's big platform. And on top of it, we have two great centers in terms of at least the knowledge, right? You have the Montreal through the Mila, you have the Vector through Toronto. I'm sure other parts of Canada are contributing as well. Like, how do we not miss it this time? At least, how do we make sure that some of the value is captured by Canadians as opposed to somewhere else? And just for those folks that aren't familiar with Novo Nordisk, it's not like Novo Nordisk is based out of China or out of like US where there's like a huge population. They're freaking based out of Denmark, right? They have a smaller population in Canada. So there's no excuse that we couldn't do it, or we could have done that as well, right? But sorry, maybe I want to get your take on it, Aaron. How do we not drop the ball this time?
I unfortunately don't have an easy or simple answer to that question. But I think asking the question like you asked the question is a great first step, right? We are the leaders in AI in the world. When you talk about Vector and all of the organizations that you described, I forget the gentleman's name, but the chief technology officer who left OpenAI, who many attribute to the incredible technological breakthroughs that has now become ubiquitous with ChatGPT, came out of Toronto. Yet, are we asking that question saying, why then did an OpenAI scale in Toronto? And I don't have the answers, and I don't think there are simple answers, and I don't think there is one answer. But I think the first step is maybe through conversations and podcasts like this and within our own groups is to start asking the question in good faith, not to put anybody down or to make anybody feel like they dropped the ball, but to say, okay, we're still at only the top of the first inning with AI. How are we going to win the game? Because we've got a bunch more innings to go. And you know what? We're down. The others, the score is down, but we can get it back, and that's how I would suggest we can maybe make some progress is through those honest questions and those really candid dialogues with each other.
So if let's make it easier. If you had the magic wand and you could actually change the landscape, what are some of the building blocks you would put in place? I mean, we know incentives is one, obviously, but are there other things? Is it the way the workflows currently exist at hospitals, or what are the other things that would become enablers for us to actually utilize some of these technologies and bring those efficiencies to our health system, let alone to commercialize and bring that revenue back to Canada?
Yeah. The first thing, which is probably the least shiny, topic, is one needs to think through procurement and procurement processes, right? If there's a great product out there, or a great idea out there, or a great thing to pilot and experiment with, um, starting just that off through a grant, you're already sort of, it's the wrong incentives because you can be really successful. And I've seen this when we talk about the startup journey. I can share many, many Canadian entrepreneurs who raised significant capital from Canadian venture capital firms, who did incredible, heroic work with Canadian institutions, only for those champions, those courageous folks at the Canadian institutions who embrace these new ways to literally cry because there is no mechanism to scale that product because it would have to go through a procurement process that was designed to not enable that product to scale from the first place.
The old death through a thousand pilots.
It's not even death through a thousand pilots. It's even if there's a successful pilot, to scale that pilot for the champion, even for the CEO of the hospital to say, I want to be able to purchase this, is incredibly difficult.
Wow.
Yeah. And even, just to make a point on that one, just for the audience sake, is like, you people may be like, oh, why is it procure? That seems like super easy. Why does that make such a big deal, right? Well, procurement, an example would be, for instance, the DOJ, Department of DoD, Department of Defense down in the U.S. Right. In many instances, their procurement process is what they call cost plus, right? Which is the overall idea is, oh, whatever the thing costs, now we allow you, the vendor, to charge a little bit more. So there was never any incentive to be more efficient because you basically made more money by being more inefficient. So that's an example of how procurement, what Aaron's talking about, is so important. Actually, it seems simple, but it's actually an incredibly important aspect of the entire ecosystem. So it's great that you point that out. Appreciate that, Aaron.
Yeah. One of the things that we did, we made it out the other side, so I can share the strategy that we were able to be successful. And let me just say, we were the first commercial AI platform to be deployed in multiple hospitals, to be deployed in provincial authorities, to get access to data, to run data, to give outputs. Because we deployed through a strategy of doing clinical studies and clinical research, not through grants, we were able to reverse the flow of procurement, meaning that in the same way companies pay hospitals to do research, to get access to their clinicians, to do clinical studies and clinical research, which is incredibly appropriate, processes that have been pressure tested, time tested, everything under ethical review and approval. But because we were flowing money into hospitals from other sources versus asking institutions to pay out for products and services, we were able to get that traction, that deployment, that commercialization. And because our development came through that, which was already with a commercial focus, second to a patient outcome focus and that North Star, we were sort of tooled and dyed in our surrounding commercial relationships to then think through other applications around how we can scale that. Right? We had that muscle memory, whereby so many is like trying to figure out, okay, we'll do a pilot, we'll go get a government grant, or we'll get funding from here. That's great, it worked. Okay, now what? And there's no open door to go anywhere else other than, okay, well, we got to do an RFP, we got to get 2 quotes. If it exceeds X, then do you have the technical requirements to be able to do an enterprise-wide deal with an institution like Hospital X? And that's where these companies and those CEOs I described, right, just couldn't compete and they had to shut down. Great Canadian business leaders, great Canadian IP being developed, died on the vine.
Now, we talked about data a lot. I mean, quite frankly, that's part of both what we do within this ecosystem. And we talked about, you mentioned privacy. So I do want to get back to that because it's such a critical component. I'm might get you in trouble here. So, you can feel free to plead the fifth, even though there's no such thing as the fifth in Canada, actually. So, but that aside, do you is privacy, bring up privacy to not share uh, data between institutes, or just share data in general so they can be used to improve clinic outcomes, or outcomes for patients. Is that a red herring? Because people share the data all the time. Like, I share my data, Facebook, whatever it may be, constantly, right? And is it a red herring? How should we think about data privacy from the patient perspective, especially coming from, I think you said, the point of view from the financial world, where I do understand if you accidentally give up your credit card information, yeah, I mean, you're in a world of hurt there, right? It could be really, really, really bad from at least financial perspective. From the patient perspective, like, how should we think about this? And I do bring up the word red herring a little bit as a devil's advocate, but feel free to take that question, go whichever way you want.
Yeah, I'll answer it happily because it's not a red herring. Um, so let me unpack that a little bit. Um, Number one, privacy should be taken and be considered at the utmost importance. And it is. And yes, we share our information on Facebook. And yes, we all read, about, this credit card information or this social is being shared. But there has to be and should be a higher bar when it comes to our health information. And privacy matters, and it's important. And the ethics around it are important. And the evolving work in AI is important, and should be taken incredibly seriously in that spirit that it shouldn't be, doesn't have to be, nor when you speak to privacy commissioners across Canada with that context in mind, do they want it to be a barrier? So again, going back to, we embedded ourselves at a hospital, and we realized, like, this is really important, and it's prescribed. We've got authorities, we've got privacy legislation, we've got certain uses. There's a lot of rules and regulations that have been designed for the proper ethical handling of PHI, depending on the particular authority that you have. So, number one, if a patient consents to share their information, and that consent isn't a buried terms and conditions in an app, but they actually say, you know what, I want my information to be used for these purposes. There is no privacy, or I wouldn't say that is a particular authority, but that information can be shared because it ultimately belongs to the patient. Our first hire at Pentavere, again, contrarian to other startup type hires, was the former chief privacy officer at UHN, who was the chief privacy officer at TD Bank, who was a former regulator, who also, when you talk about why, gravitated to the mission of, if we can unlock this information and what it can do to help patients. And we designed standard operating procedures, data handling. We put in all of these things, which was an investment, massive investment. But we put in all of these pieces up front, and that built trust. And then we were able to go to privacy commissions and say, here's our data, here's our flows, here's how we're doing it. Here's our thinking behind, here's the safeguards and protections we've put in place. And what you would find is that then became an accelerator to some of the work that we are doing today, which is, sharing data with the appropriate authorities in the appropriate ways to identify patients and provide that insight to various stakeholders so we can all close care gaps and improve outcomes together. So just framing it as a red herring, I think is my advice is, it's not a red herring. Treat it the way it should be retreated, and then you'd be surprised around, even with our sort of archaic legislation at times, the amount of things you can do. And I'll just finish off on this for the entrepreneurs listening, because sometimes what you most need resides in the place you least want to go, and what you think is your biggest impediment ends up being competitive advantage. So we've done a lot of this in Canada. And Canada does not have a reputation for being progressive or on the leading edge of taking risks with sharing data, especially sharing data with pharmaceutical companies, especially using AI. But we did it and satisfied those requirements. So as we're having conversations, let's say with global life science companies who are saying, how do we think about ex-USA data and creating centers of excellence? How do we think about GDPR? The fact that we've done these things under the Canadian framework, we actually moved to the top of the pecking order, being actually having an advantage to US vendors because they built their privacy models under HIPAA, which has a lower bar in certain areas. So this has ended up being an advantage to us that's allowing us to accelerate and scale now under the Healwell AI story, that you would think because it's, some of the challenges would be an impediment. So I think that's an insight that we're really happy to share, and with this community, around privacy in particular.
Great, great. No, thanks a lot for all your time and your dedication to, of course, the patient, to the ecosystem in general, the industry in general, for all the hard work that you guys do over at Pentavere. I don't know, Costas, do you have any last question for Aaron? Because I don't want to take up too much more of her time. We're kind of over already, so we always get our producer always tells us we go over. So unfortunately, we did that again. But fascinating conversation, of course, right?
That's all right. We'll take the time. You know what? My one last question. I feel remiss if we didn't ask it. Is sort of what has the sort of acquisition by Healwell brought to Pentavere? Because I'm sure there were synergies there, but how has it been able to sort of scale your mission?
Yeah. If you think about Heal Well, and particularly the strategic alliance agreement that it has with Well Health Technologies, which is the largest private healthcare provider in Canada. So, owner and operator of clinics, owner and operator of electronic medical record systems, owner and operating of different platforms to help with things like interoperability. So imagine taking, you know, what we've just talked about in terms of, the work we've done at Pentavere and Darwin, and embedding that into that ecosystem to appropriately unlock the data, to be able to elevate the features and benefits of how electronic health record systems work in terms of clinical decision support to improve care through our provider networks, but then also to create mechanisms to share that with third parties, so collectively a broader community can work to close care gaps. There's very few organizations globally that has all of those pieces in, call it, the supply chain. So that's the incredibly compelling, opportunity from a scale perspective. And I'll just end it, Lester. You've been incredibly gracious. Costas, you've been incredibly gracious. But the work that you are doing at Exactus, and this is why I was so humbled and excited to be at the on the board and support your mission, is just as impactful in terms of personalized healthcare. The infrastructure that Exactus has created in terms of data and insights, and to move forward, precision oncology, generate real world evidence, is just as cutting edge. Both of you are just as much pioneers as I may be in the space. Probably have your own war stories. I know you have your own war stories because I sit on the board. But together, another organization that should be applauded, should be recognized for battling through some of these headwinds, experiencing some of the tailwinds that we've been talking about, but to ultimately improve outcomes for patients. So I just wanted to end in congratulate both of you on your incredible success as well.
Great. Very much appreciate it, Aaron. If people want to kind of connect with you or read more about what you do you have a Twitter or anything you want to kind of share from a handle perspective?
Yeah, I don't have a Twitter, although I'm thinking about that. I am on LinkedIn. I am starting to post more on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. or you can send me an email, at aleiptag at pentavere.ai. I think it's on our website. I try to be as accessible as I can, and would love to have conversations with folks who are equally as passionate, equally as committed to some of the themes that we've spoken about today.
Perfect, perfect. Just for the folks that want to check up a little bit on what Aaron and Pentavere are doing. So if you go online, URL is Pentavere, so Pentavere.ai for more information about Pentavere, and you can probably reach Aaron through Pentavere, and then Pentavere's Twitter handle is quickly at Pentavere. So at and then Pentavere for more information from Pentavere and from Aaron. So thanks again,
Thank
Aaron, for
you.
jumping on. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And if you like the episode, please subscribe, please like, follow. Of course, if you have any questions, please post them on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.